as we talk about Christians in contemporary culture. I'll invite you at home or here in the fellowship hall, Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. We're going to really dig into those verses as we talk about Christians in contemporary culture. And this is our second lesson in this series. Our theme verse, if you will, that kind of springboards this entire discussion is 1 Chronicles 12:32. As we look to this kind of obscure tribe of Issachar, we know the 12 tribes of Israel, where one of the tribes is the tribe of Issachar. And notice in this passage, and we looked at this passage in our previous Bible study last week as well, but just by way of reminder, of Issachar, men who had understanding of the times. And as we explore being a Christian in contemporary culture, this is the challenge, that we would be men and women who have understanding of the times. For what purpose? Well, for the men of Issachar, to know what Israel ought to do. I'm sure for many of us, when we look at the world around us, we often wonder, what are we supposed to do? Things are changing at warp speed. I don't understand what's going on in the culture and the world around me. What am I to do? We need to pray that the Lord would give us a spirit and a heart and a mind such as the men of Issachar had, because they understood the times and they were able to give advice to Israel what Israel should do. And that's what we want to be. We want to be people who know what we should do. So let's look at some definitions of culture. I had a couple definitions last week that were really short. These are some longer definitions, and then we're just going to flesh this out tonight. So here's one definition of culture. Culture is the totality of socially transmitted behavior patterns, arts, beliefs, institutions, and all other products of human work and thought. These patterns, traits, and products considered as the expression of a particular period, class, community, or population. So basically it's saying everything that it is to be human and everything that human beings do and create is considered culture. And you could have multiple cultures in one location. So in one home. So those parents out there that are raising teenagers, or you have had children, remember when your child was a teenager, it was almost like having another culture inside the home that had one culture. So teenagers would like one thing, and parents like another thing. I remember distinctly as a young man growing up and the type of music that I was listening to. And I remember my dad coming into my room and saying, "Son, why don't you listen to a different kind of music?" And I said, "What do you mean, Dad? Like what?" He said, "Well, you know, bands like the Animals." And I was listening to Boys II Men. And he just was like, "Well, you know, like the Animals." There was two completely different cultures right under the same roof. And we can see that. Or you could think of Southern culture or Northern culture. Or I've said it many times here at Abbott's Creek, I don't consider myself a Northerner, I'm a Midwesterner. And for Midwesterners, it kind of irritates us when we get called Northerners, because when we think of Northerners, I think of New York and Jersey or Boston, right? That's different than Midwesterners. But then there's Southern culture. And Southern culture, you have certain ways of talking, certain food types, certain sports that we enjoy. Okay, there's even within the United States, there's different cultures. So we need to understand that when we're talking about Christians in contemporary culture, this could change from place to place. So how Christians in High Point, North Carolina, or Abbott's Creek Missionary Baptist Church interact with the world around us would be different than how Christians might react to the culture around them if they lived in San Francisco, or if they lived in Minneapolis, or if they lived in Duluth, or wherever. It's going to differ. And that's why we need to ask the Lord to give us wisdom like the men of Issachar had. Here's a second definition. The shared beliefs, philosophies, and values of a particular place in a particular time. Cultures change. Cultures change. And so the church and Christians need to be aware of the changing culture while standing on the unchanging truth of God's Word. And this is where the conflict often arises, all right, when we talk about culture, because culture changes, but as Christians, we stand on that which does not change. I want to share this idea of cultural power, and this came from Al Mohler. Again, I mentioned his book, Culture Shift, last week. I'm reading another book that he's written, The Gathering Storm. And in an interview about The Gathering Storm, he mentioned this concept of cultural power. And by power, he meant those things that, or institutions that exert influence to shape the narrative or shape the thinking of a community. All right? Cultural power. Well, I think it's pretty obvious, and if those of you here in the fellowship hall are watching on Facebook, if you aren't aware of who has the cultural power in the United States of America, then I hope that this Bible study will help you become aware. Because as we think about cultural power, this will have a lot to say with regards to how we as Christians respond to not having power. And again, by power we mean influence. So here are the three institutions of cultural power that Al Mohler alluded to. Number one is Hollywood. Does Hollywood exert any influence on society? Yes. We watch TV or we watch streaming shows or movies. Hollywood. And Hollywood has a particular worldview, a particular way of seeing what life is, or what people are. What does it mean to be a human? What is morally right and wrong? What is good? What is evil? Hollywood. Higher education. Okay? Higher education. Now, you may say, well, I've never been, I don't go to the big 4-year university, I didn't go there. Well, the people that make the decisions did. It was a big deal, whatever your political position is, it was a big deal when Justice Amy Coney Barrett was nominated and then approved and put on the Supreme Court, because she's the first justice to be appointed to the Supreme Court that didn't graduate from an Ivy League college or university. She's currently the only justice on the Supreme Court that didn't go to an Ivy League university. And a big deal was made of that because of culture. She went to the University of Notre Dame and taught there. And there was a big deal because she didn't go to Yale or Harvard, which has one culture and one way of thinking. And the idea was Notre Dame there in northern Indiana has a different way of thinking. It's a religious institution. And so there was this conversation about what cultural, what approach, what perspective would she bring to the bench, and how would that mesh with the perspective of those that went to the Ivy League institutions. Higher education, the universities, they shape the way culture makers think. Our young people and Christian parents really need to think long and hard about these issues. Because as we're going to see in a few minutes, these cultural influencers, this isn't the cultural influencers of a few decades ago. The thinking has radically changed. I mentioned this last week. When you consider Hollywood as a cultural influencer, there was a time where Hollywood maybe influenced our culture for good, or it held up what were seen as traditional moral values. And I mentioned Andy Griffith. Okay. There was a time where that was what was held up, and these were the top shows on television. Or even, I think, in the 80s, you think about the top shows on television, The Cosby Show, and it held up, you had a mom and a dad raising children. You just had these kind of values that were held up. And they were family. Family was the focus. In the 80s, I'll just use that as an example. You had The Cosby Show, you had Family Ties, and shows like that centered around a family unit. Fast forward 10 years, what were the #1 shows from Hollywood? Seinfeld and Friends. There were no family units. And the family was portrayed as dysfunctional. In just 10 years. Do you think that has an impact on culture, the way we think? It certainly does. And Christians, we need to just be aware of this. That's all we're trying to say. Be aware of this. And the third cultural power influencer is big business or corporations. Google, Twitter, we're on Facebook, Microsoft, Apple. These big corporations, they have the power culturally to influence the way we think, what we react to. When we go onto Google and you type in what you want to search, what comes up? There's an algorithm. What comes up in your search? The studies have shown people don't move very far down past the first page in their search. And so Google or Twitter or all these social media companies, they can influence the way we think. What our priorities are, what is good, what is bad. And they have tremendous power to do that. By power, again, we mean influence. They're influencers, and we need to be aware of this, these cultural influencers. Now, these cultural influencers, they set the cultural tone. And Christians, we need to ask how these are shaping us. How are you, Christian, being shaped by these cultural centers of power? Are you uncritical? Or are you aware, okay, of the influence that is being exerted? And I think oftentimes we're maybe unaware and then we're surprised. And we need to just be aware of these influencers. And then this is where we come into this conflict. Because there was a time in the history of the United States of America in which the church was the cultural influencer. Even if the vast majority of people were not born-again, Bible-believing Christians, there was still this influence of Christianity in the church throughout culture in general. And so when we look at who influences culture now, we can have one of two responses, Christian. Response number one is what we would call the compromise and give in response. And response number two would be what we call the contentious or let's fight response. Okay? So let me just mention response number one first, the compromise or give in response. So some Christian denominations have given in to the cultural pressure. And one area where this is really telling is in sexual ethics. So historically, Christianity has taught a certain view of sexual ethics. That all sexual activity outside of that between a married man and a married woman is sinful. Well, the culture says the opposite. Hollywood, higher education, big business, all three of these say the complete opposite. And we're bombarded with that thought. And churches, Christian denominations, who want to have influence in culture, want to be relevant, in many cases have given in to that cultural pressure when it comes to a biblical sexual ethic. Because they don't like the idea of not having a seat at the table. And therefore, they've given in. Major denominations in the United States of America, just within the last couple of years, the United Methodists, they had a huge fight. They thought the denomination was going to split over the issue of ordaining and affirming same-sex marriage. They had a huge split within the denomination. And other mainline denominations have given into this issue, have diverted from what has been known as a Christian sexual ethic. And they've given in because they want to have influence. Or they are being influenced by the culture. The culture is shaping the church rather than the other way around. But for many watching this video, I imagine your response will be more along the line of frustration. You want your influence back. And so there's a sense in which we dig and say, I want to have influence back. This country is founded on Jesus Christ. We're going to fight and pull it back. And that causes us not to see our neighbors as individuals who need Jesus, but as enemies. Okay? And then we take the other tactic, and we don't want to do that either. Now, if you are still not convinced, and you probably, those on Facebook watching this, and maybe even you in the fellowship hall, this chart, there it is. You probably can't see it. This was just done this year, February 4th through the 15th. The Pew Research Center did a survey of U.S. adults, and the survey was on percent of U.S. adults who say Christianity's influence on American life is. So this is what we're talking about. Cultural influence. Does Christianity have cultural influence? And the net is it's decreasing. More than half of all U.S. adults believe that Christianity's influence is decreasing in culture. Decreasing. And it breaks it down. Broadly Christian, you have Protestant, white evangelical, white non-evangelical, black Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, so on and so forth. And all, up to right here, believe that it is decreasing. And so, surveys show this, that the church, our influence is decreasing. And we just need to be aware of that. I mentioned it last week, as Ed Stetzer has put it, we don't have home field advantage. We just need to be aware of that. Because when we're aware of it, then we can evaluate, how should I respond? Lord, help me to be like the men of Issachar. Know how I should respond. There's a net decrease in influence. How will we respond? And so we're going to consider tonight the negative response. Okay, we're going to kind of lean that direction. And then next week, we're going to consider a more positive response. How we should respond. I'm going to give you some practical tools and ways in which we can respond. All right, so let's look at what is the world thinking about? What is the world thinking about? And what do I mean by this? I mean, what are the big ideas shaping the world in which we live in, specifically our culture, our immediate culture, the United States of America, or Western culture? This is what we're talking about. These big ideas, these isms, okay? And broadly, we can say our culture is secular. It's broad secularism. What does this mean? It means that the binding religious authority, and decades ago, the binding religious authority, that even if people weren't practicing Christians, they understood that there is a God and the Bible's His Word, and we should probably, in some sense, live underneath that authority. So secularism is that the binding religious authority has been receding for the past century. Remember last week, you can go back and look at the study. I read the speech from J. Gresham Machen, what was it, from 1913? And he talked about 30 years ago the church had more influence. So for the past century, there's been this erosion of religious authority. But this has gone, here's where the challenge we're at now. This erosion has gone into warp speed over the last 10 to 15 years. So things that used to take decades to change in times past now take literally months to change. Or at least it feels that way probably to many of us. That things are changing in our culture at such a rapid rate, we can't keep up. Sometimes in my own ministry life, I feel overwhelmed trying to keep up. And we have to not do that. Trying to keep up with what's going on so I can answer every question and address every issue. What's the latest thing happening? What's a young person seeing on TikTok or on social media? The latest thing I've got to be aware of, and that can just overwhelm us. And so we want to be aware, what is the world thinking about? Well, here are 4 broad categories. First of all, the world thinks, our culture thinks, relativism. There's no absolute truth. And we alluded to this in our Apologetics 101 studies as well. Second, pluralism. All competing worldviews are equally valid. Now let me put a little addendum to that. Here's how our culture has moved at warp speed. Here's the challenge we have. Pluralism, the idea that all competing worldviews are equally valid, over the last decade has come to stop short of saying that Orthodox Christian worldview is valid. And that's where we're at. I'm not trying to be a fearmonger or anything, but you go and read some of the literature that is out there, how Christians are portrayed, and yes, all these plethora of worldviews are acceptable, but if you are a Bible-believing Christian that holds to the doctrines as taught in Scripture, and specifically on the sexual ethic, I know I keep coming back to that, but that is really where the wedge has happened, then your worldview is not valid. Many times the culture would say that. Your worldview needs to be put in the corner and not talked about in polite conversation. Okay, I was reading in the Gathering Storm just this evening, and Al Mohler was addressing issues surrounding homeschooling in Britain, and how Britain's trying to get a homeschooling register together for the express purpose that if parents were teaching their children Orthodox, traditional Christian sexual ethic, the government would come in and stop them, because that's considered an act of violence to teach that. And so we have to be. I'm sorry for that. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, a little glitch. I'm going to explain to you what the glitch was, because it happened right as I was talking about loneliness and isolation on social media. So this works out. Very good. On my phone, and let me encourage you parents to have your young people do the same thing. On my phone, some of my social media apps, like my Facebook app, I have a timer on them, which means after it reaches a certain number of minutes, the app shuts down. Well, my timer on my Facebook app was 45 minutes a day, and we must have exceeded that today. It shut down. So that's what happened. And let me challenge you to do that on your own apps and on your young person's app, because we need to combat this isolationism thing going on. All right? Because we get sucked into the virtual world, and that's not healthy. So how have you, when you think about the way the world thinks, how have you seen these ideas influencing the way Christians live, and in particular, how you live? And this is what we're challenging tonight, this negative concept of, the title of this second lesson is Too Cozy with Culture. Are we being influenced by these ways of thinking? Okay? And do you think that this influence is active or passive? Now, I would argue it's passive. We aren't aware many times we're being influenced by culture until it's too late. So, got a picture here of a frog in water. Now, I was telling Amy and Sandy this illustration today, and they had never heard it. And if you've heard the illustration of the frog in water, the question is, how do you boil a frog in water? Well, they say, I've never tested this, and let me advise, don't test this. You can boil a frog in water if you slowly turn the temperature up. The frog will get cozy in the warm water and will not jump out until it's too late, and they boil to death. And that is often what's happening. Maybe we're being boiled alive in culture. It's just incremental. I mean, and the devil works that way too. If it happened right in our face, we would retreat. We'd say, oh, that's bad. But it happens subtly. And it tears down our resistance. And it transforms our way of thinking to where many Christians are influenced so dramatically by the culture that we don't look any different than the culture, that our witness is compromised to the culture. Religious sociologist, his name's Christian Smith, he's coined a term that most Christians, their religion amounts to this. He calls it moralistic therapeutic deism. And this is a hot thing that's been going on for about 10, 12 years. I read his book where he coined this, Soul Searching the Religious Lives of America's Teenagers. And he says most Christians have a moralistic therapeutic deist faith, not a real faith. What is that? Well, most Christians, and this is based on his surveys, they hold to this idea of moralism that God basically just wants us to be good and do nice things. Therapeutic, that God is there to make us feel good and feel better. And deism, meaning that God really isn't involved in our everyday lives. And therefore, live our lives as if God isn't there. Just as long as I'm being nice and I'm happy emotionally, God isn't concerned with my life. And according to his research, that is how most Christians behave. In his book, that book I referenced, Soul Searching, the stats about most teenagers, that's the kind of faith they have. They just think God wants them to be good and wants them to be happy, and other than that, he's really not concerned. Well, that's not biblical Christianity. And that's the influence that culture has had on our faith tradition. Now, there's nothing wrong with being practical. Okay, you always hear, I like practical teaching. That's fine, but there's some things that are just true when they're not practical. But we want to hear things like, 5 ways to be a better husband, and 6 ways to save my money, and 10 ways to be happy. And really, we just need to dive in and say, on Christ a solid rock I stand, on other ground is sinking sand, and dig down deep so that when culture's changing, we're not drifting to and fro with culture. So how do we avoid this? Now we come to our verses tonight. How do we avoid being the frog in boiling water? Well, we need to be aware. So look at Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. I'll share these verses and then we will be done. Paul writing, he says, I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God. So Paul starts his challenge with an appeal to the gospel. And that's what I'm going to do, by an appeal, the gospel. The message, the good news of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of our sins. That's the gospel. I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world. Do not be influenced unduly by the cultural power centers of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. 3 points I'm drawing out of how to not boil like a frog in water. How to avoid being boiled in the water. Number 1, be a living sacrifice. That's what Paul says. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. The first step, as a Christian living in contemporary culture, because we're all aware the culture is going to be hostile to what we believe. I hope you're aware of that. Therefore, the first step is to yield to Christ in full. Many of us are taken in by the culture because we yield to Christ in part. There are no half measures. And we're going to talk about this next week. The early church is the template when I think about Christians in contemporary culture. And that's a teaser. Okay, the early church is the template. We're going to look at that next week. But we need to be a living sacrifice. Fully yielded to Christ if we don't want to boil. Second, be a transformed person. The second step is to be transformed in your thinking. Do you notice in the verse? Do not be conformed to this world. That's don't boil in the water. That's what he's saying. Don't be pressed in. But instead of boiling the water, be transformed. How? By the renewal of your mind. Our thinking. So let me back up. All of these are worldviews, ways of thinking about life. This is the ideas that the culture puts out there every day. We need to be renewed in our minds. And when we're renewed in our minds, we are transformed. Okay? Transformation happens here. All right? And then third, and this just kind of summarizes the first two, be a thinking Christian. That's what I want to challenge you tonight. Be aware of the cultural influencers. Okay? And when you're aware, don't respond. The church has done this in the West by giving in and compromising the cultural ideas, because all the denominations that have done that are dying or are dead. Okay? But the denominations and the churches that hold on to the truth of the scriptures, those are the ones that will thrive and survive. But we need to be a thinking Christian. And that means being aware of what is going on around us, so we're not surprised, we don't become angry, we don't want to give in to fear. Christians in contemporary culture, we should never be fearful people. We need to ask the why and the what type of questions. Why is this happening? What are they doing? What is the goal? What is the purpose? What is being taught? What ideas are being communicated? Parents, I'm talking directly to you. I hope you're tuning in tonight. You need to, and I mentioned my daughter Abigail last week, getting frustrated about this, but really, you need to engage in what questions with your children. When you're watching television, when you're watching shows, what are they teaching? I've done this before, and it frustrates my children. We're watching a show, and I pause it. And I say, what idea is being communicated there? Because if we're just passive, the idea is just, then we wake up and the world in which we live has completely gone too far. And we're trying to equip ourselves and our children, the next generation, to be Christians who live to the glory of God and the love of neighbor in this contemporary culture. Well, if you have any questions, please reach out on the Facebook page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first part of this message, and then when the Facebook decided to cut me off, and the second part of this message, and I'm going to edit them and splice them, put them together, and then I'll put them on our YouTube page so you can watch the whole thing. I hope this has been beneficial to you. If you have any questions, reach out here on the Facebook page. Reach out to me here at the church. We'll be glad to answer those. Next week, we'll finish up this series, and we're going to talk about how to biblically impact culture. And I hope you have a blessed week. I hope to see you Sunday. Be in prayer for the students as we go to Caswell. God bless.